Hello, everyone. My name is Natalia Anna Michna, and I'm an assistant professor at the Faculty of Philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Kraków, Poland. And I am here today to share with you my short presentation about care, hospitality, and sisterhood. And I'm going to talk about fostering communities in post-socialist feminist art in Poland. Let me begin with some words of introduction about the feminist politics of care in post-socialist context. So, following the collapse of state socialism in 1989, Poland entered a turbulent period of neoliberal transformation. This shift brought with it a valorization of individualism, productivity, and competition, all those traits aligned with masculinized capitalist values. Within this new paradigm, practices traditionally associated with women, like care work, hospitality, empathy, were further marginalized and rendered apolitical. As scholars, Polish scholars, such as Agnieszka Graf and Ewa Majewska have pointed out, the reprivatization of these effective labor practices resulted in their devaluation, simultaneously stripping them of their political potential. Yet recent crises, social crises, have catalyzed a reconsideration of these devalued practices. The COVID-19 pandemic made visible the precarity and indispensability of care work. On the other hand, the war in Ukraine brought unprecedented flows of refugees, highlighting hospitality as both a humanitarian necessity and a feminist political act. Simultaneously, Poland's increasingly authoritarian government has attacked women's rights, especially through its near-total abortion ban, galvanizing feminist responses in both protest and art. It is in this very shifting landscape that we witness today a resurgence of feminist art practices centered on care, empathy, hospitality, and sisterhood. These practices challenge dominant models of political action by embracing what Majewska terms weak resistance, an embodied, persistent, often quiet opposition to oppressive systems. Let us take a look at sisterhood as a framework for political and artistic practice. So, the feminist notion of sisterhood, famously articulated by Robin Morgan in 1970s, has often been dismissed as idealistic or essentialist. However, in the context of post-socialist feminist art in Poland, sisterhood emerges not as biologically determined bond, but as an ethical and political choice. It denotes a form of affective solidarity, a commitment to collective action rooted in empathy, sincerity, care, and mutual presence. This reconceptualized sisterhood is non-hierarchical, inclusive, and deeply relational. It invites participants to step beyond individual comfort zones and to engage in forms of togetherness that are both emotionally resonant and politically meaningful. Feminist art that adapts this framework becomes a vehicle for forging communal bonds and imagining alternatives to patriarchal and neoliberal modes of organization. By foregrounding affect and relationality, these art practices draw on what Sarah Ahmed famously calls feminist survival strategies, or forms of endurance and connection that resist the alienation imposed by oppressive systems. So rather than staging grand acts of defense, they cultivate what Olga Tokarczuk, a Polish Nobel Prize winner, has described as an uneventful feminist revolt, persistent, intimate, and intersubjective acts of resistance. This paper employs feminist storytelling as both a methodology and an epistemological stance. As practice, feminist storytelling centers lived experience, emotion, and relationality as sources of knowledge. It disrupts the linearity and objectivity of traditional academic discourse, allowing for a more nuanced and embodied engagement with artistic practice. Through storytelling, I explored the traces of Sisterhood workshop not only as an artistic event, but as a political space shaped by affective labor, shared vulnerability, and collaborative creation. In this way, storytelling becomes both an analytical and an ethical tool, one that reflects the values of the very practices it seeks to understand. Now let's take a look at the Sisterhood, Traces of Sisterhood workshop. In May 2022, amidst ongoing political unrest and humanitarian crisis, the Traces of Sisterhood workshop took place at the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw. Organized by a group of feminist artists and educators, the workshop invited students, faculty members, and also members of the broader community to explore sisterhood as both a concept and as a practice. Participants engaged in a collective art making, shared meals, storytelling cycles, and discussions. The emphasis was not on producing objects for exhibition, but on cultivating a shared space of care, vulnerability, and presence. The event marked the beginning of a multi-year project aimed at exploring sisterhood as a mode of social organization and artistic practice. Hospitality in the workshop was not a symbolic gesture but a lived experience. The space was arranged to be welcoming with cushions, communal tables, and quiet corners. Food was prepared and shared, emphasizing the communal and embodied dimensions of care. All these acts, often dismissed as peripheral or domestic, were central to the workshop's ethos. They exemplified what feminist scholars call today the politics of everyday life, turning the seemingly mundane into the profoundly political. Art making, too, was approached as a form of care during the workshop. Participants co-created textile pieces, soundscapes, and performative rituals that reflected their collective experiences. These practices emphasized process over product, inviting reflection, dialogue, and a mutual support. One of the most striking features of the workshop was the space it created for emotional vulnerability. Participants were encouraged to share personal stories, but not as confessions, but as offerings. Through these stories, a network of resonances emerged. Pain and joy, fear and hope became shared affective experiences that fostered a sense of solidarity. This affective solidarity was not premised on sameness, but on attunement, or a willingness to listen, to witness, and to be present. In this way, Sisterhood functioned not as an identity category, but as a relational ethic. It was enacted through small gestures, shared silences, and collaborative acts of meaning making. The Traces of Sisterhood workshop exemplifies a broader shift in feminist art in Poland toward redefining political agency. In contrast to the dominant models that equate agency with visibility, autonomy, and assertive action, these practices embrace relational, collective, and affective forms of agency. This aligns, for example, with recent feminist theorizing that foregrounds care as a mode of resistance, like in the works of Tronto or Puig de la Bella Casa. By centering care and hospitality, post-socialist feminist art in Poland reclaims these devalued practices as politically potent. They become tools for sustaining communities, resisting alienation, and imagining new forms of social organization. This is particularly significant in a context where women's rights are currently under attack and civic space is shrinking today in Poland. In challenging the neoliberal valorization of independence and competition, these art practices propose an alternative ethos, one grounded in interdependence, mutual aid, and emotional presence. They invite us to rethink what counts as political, expanding the terrain of resistance to include the intimate, the affective, and the everyday. I think it's worth recalling here the words of the workshop participants who, in their search for the meaning of sisterhood, found it in the following areas. They begin with the question, what then is sisterhood? Sisterhood is leaving one's comfort zone, joint action, a common goal, non-hierarchical cooperation, seeking forms of social organization other than patriarchy, inclusiveness, new ways of working with memory, empowerment, empathy, openness, honesty, community beyond divisions, caring, sharing, always remembering those who are disadvantaged, hospitality, presence and awareness of presence, support and stimulation, building her story, not thinking about oneself, and sometimes precisely thinking about oneself. To conclude, let's move toward a politics of tenderness, as I call it. In Poland's post-socialist landscape, the feminist turn toward care, hospitality, and sisterhood offers a quiet but potent form of resistance. The Traces of Sisterhood workshop is emblematic of this shift, demonstrating how feminist art can function as a space of affective solidarity, ethical engagement, and collective healing. By embracing the aesthetics of care and the ethics of relationality, feminist artists in Poland are not only challenging the devaluation of traditionally feminine practices, but they also are reshaping the very notion of political agency. In doing so, they enact what Olga Tokarczuk has called a tender revolution. So a movement grounded not in spectacle, but in presence, not in domination, but in mutuality. This paper has argued that post-socialist feminist art practices in Poland expand the political imagination by centering sisterhood as both a concept and a practice. They foster communities that resist, care, and endure, quietly, tenderly, collectively, and persistently. Thank you very much for your attention.